Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandy Young. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and the admissions manager at John Muir Behavioral Health Center in Concord. And on behalf of John Muir Health and our wonderful partner, the Ultimate Fieldhouse in Walnut Creek, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. Thanks so much for being here. I know grief and loss is not a fun topic, but your willingness to learn more about grief and loss will help you support your teenager during this time. We're going to start with an overview of grief and loss, and then look at some of what our teens have lost during this time, and then end with a summary of things you can do to communicate with your teen about grief and loss so that you can provide support to them. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. We invite your questions. We hope to answer as many of them as possible. I plan to leave 20 minutes at the end for questions, which will be answered by me, Cindy Bolter, who is a nurse practitioner and our Chief Nursing and Operations Officer at John Muir Behavioral Health, along with Jeremy Topman, who is a licensed clinical social worker and certified addiction specialist, and also the clinical director of our behavioral health outpatient programs. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. If we don't get to your question for any reason, we plan to post answers to questions on our website, johnmuirhealth.com, and along with those answers, we will also have a recorded version of tonight's presentation and this slide deck. Also, next week, same time, same place, we will have the third installment of this series. We will be talking about parenting during COVID-19, some of the challenges that parents are facing, and we hope to have that discussion apply to parents of children and adolescents. Okay, so let's talk about grief and loss and how that's defined. Grief is a natural response to loss. And more specifically, it's the emotional pain that we experience when something we care about is taken from us. So I've included this photo of former President George H.W. Bush's service dog. He's holding vigil in front of his casket. It's a powerful photo. I placed it here to remind us that everyone experiences grief. Babies, toddlers, children, teens, adults, and even animals. Grief really is an equalizer. There's nothing unhealthy or pathological about grief. If someone is grieving, they're not sick or weak, they're not mentally ill, they're not broken. Unfortunately, all of us will experience grief at one point or another. So what is loss? Some examples of loss that we're most familiar with would be death and dying. Others would be any time that there's the end of a relationship, and that certainly doesn't have to be the end of a romantic relationship like a breakup or divorce. It can be the end of a friendship, finding out someone isn't who you thought they were. Putting a pet to sleep is certainly traumatizing, but having that animal run away and not knowing what happened to them, not having that closure, that adds another layer of grief. Losing a job is painful. It's a blow to our egos. It's a blow to our identity. Moving, changing schools, that also creates grief, even if those were changes that we chose. So even if we move across the country to be with a significant other, or even if your child asked to change schools for whatever reason, it doesn't mean that there still isn't grief related to losing something familiar. We also might experience loss over something material. I still remember my 3-year-old losing her daddy shirt at the zoo. And this shirt was my husband's shirt, an old shirt that she carried around with her like a security blanket. We did find the shirt, but I can still hear the panic and the crying and the trauma that she was going through because she lost something so significant and so valuable to her. And as an adult, maybe someone has passed on a special piece of jewelry to you. And if one day you couldn't locate that item, that would trigger grief and loss. And then there are those of us who are in the sandwich generation. We're caring for our kids as well as our aging parents. Maybe we've had to tell mom that it's time to stop driving. We've had to talk to dad about selling the house and moving somewhere where there's care provided. They're grieving their loss of independence, and we're grieving alongside them because our family system is changing. So some common reactions to loss. This certainly isn't an all-inclusive list, but a lot of us will experience shock because we just can't believe that what's happening is actually happening. Anger, of course, happens because loss is very unfair and it causes us pain. And I think teenagers are more quick to anger for a variety of reasons. So this anger might be the feeling that you're experiencing more in your home at this time. Teenagers have a lot of raging hormones that get in the way of their ability to regulate themselves. They don't have a lot of impulse control, and they don't have the same life experience that we have as we mature. For example, we as adults know that it's not okay to lose control at our boss. We might be thinking a lot of things that we'd like to say to them, but we don't say those things because we don't want to lose our job. But teenagers haven't had all of those life experiences to know that they need to censor themselves and control themselves. So teens are more apt to lash out, maybe even break something, slam doors, that type of thing. Sadness manifests as crying, isolating, withdrawing, not enjoying the things that you usually like to do. Guilt is where you believe that there was something you could have done to prevent the loss. Maybe that's true. Maybe you were the person who left the gate unlocked and that's how the dog got out and ran away. But other times the guilt is not rational. Maybe you're thinking, oh, if only I had gone to church more, then this person that I care about wouldn't have passed away. Anxiety is triggered when we're fearful that more bad things will happen. The loss is already bad. What else is coming? We also get anxious that we're never going to get past this grief, that we're always going to feel this way, that we'll never feel like ourselves again. And then, of course, grief affects our bodies as well. So as you look at your teenagers and what they might be going through right now, pay attention to any changes to their appetite, their sleep, their ability to focus and concentrate. Let's talk about different stages of grief. So Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified 5 stages that most people experience related to grief. These stages can happen in any order. They can happen all at the same time, or they can happen, we could skip some of those stages as well. Grief is very individualized. So think about a loss that has been experienced in your family. You and your sibling may have had very different responses, likely because you and your sibling have different personalities, you have different ways of coping, and you probably had a different relationship to the person who passed away. So let's break down each stage and think about how these stages might apply to a teenager who is living through this pandemic. Denial is where your teenager doesn't believe that this is happening. So they refuse to believe that there's even a pandemic. How can this be? We're living in modern times, and seems like this is something that we only need to worry about over in Asia or Europe. It certainly isn't going to come over here. And anyways, I'm a teenager. I'm invincible. Nothing happens to me. I'm healthy. I'm young. My lungs are fine. I certainly don't need to be worrying about this. Next would be anger, because they're angry that all of this is happening. There's all kinds of rules being enforced. They might be angry at the government for closing things down. They're angry at the school for canceling all the events they were looking forward to. Maybe they're angry at God or the universe that this is happening. And of course, they're angry at us because as parents, we're enforcing the shelter-in-place order. We're not letting them go see their boyfriend or go hang out at their friend's house. Bargaining comes when we're desperately trying to have control over the situation. So, certainly if you've lost someone, you may have found yourself bargaining and thinking, oh, maybe if I were a better person, this wouldn't be happening. Or don't take this person, take me, I've lived longer. Our teenagers are bargaining with us. They're pleading and saying, why can't I go drive down and park in the parking lot with everybody else? I promise I won't get out of the car. I promise I won't touch anybody. Or why won't you let me just go down to Target for an hour? I'll be right back. I just have to get some stuff. I have to get out of this house. I'll keep my mask on the whole time. Depression doesn't always look like crying in teenagers. So look for irritability. It could manifest in them holding themselves up in their room. Maybe they're withdrawing, not just from the family, but also from friends. You notice that they're not interested in any hobbies. They're not seeming to enjoy any of the things they usually like to do. And then acceptance is the goal. So this is where our teenager isn't necessarily okay with everything that's going on, but they're recognizing it is what it is. I need to use coping skills. Maybe your teen is even able to have some hope and see that there might be an end in sight eventually. So something I'd really like you to take away from tonight is the idea that new grief can remind us of old grief. So, you know, if you've experienced a job loss, let's say, you might have noticed during that time that you also started to remember your feelings from your divorce 5 years before, or remembering someone that passed away previously. And this is because feelings are feelings. The mind and the body, they don't really distinguish between situations. So feelings of grief can be compounded by previous feelings of grief, even if it was a long time ago, and even if you had already worked through those feelings. And we'll touch on this more again later. So what have our teens lost? They've lost so much. We know they've lost all their routine and all their activities, but it's more than about them being bored, right? All of the things that they used to go to all the time, those were things that contributed to their sense of self, to their self-worth. If you ask a teenager, who are you? They're likely to say, oh, I'm a junior. I'm a second-degree black belt. I'm a JV cheerleader. I'm a youth group leader, right? They really identify with the things that they're engaged in. These are things that make them proud. So it's not just that they have more spare time right now, but they've lost a big part of their identity. They've also lost the ability to connect physically with their friends. So sure, we know they have their phones, they're FaceTiming, they're all over social media, but they don't have that physical connection. They're not walking home with each other. They're not piling into the car together. They're not, piling onto the couch playing video games together. Some of our teenagers are sexually active. And even if they're not, they don't get to hug each other. They're not holding hands. They're not tossing a football back and forth. So not only do they not get to physically connect, but these are ways they relieve stress and relax. What about all the things that they needed to do? So not necessarily things they wanted to do, but things they had to get over with. These were hurdles that were going to help them reach their goals. All of that stuff has been interrupted now. There's all the events that signal the end of the school year. So many fun things. Things they've been raising money for all year. Maybe they were part of a planning committee. And, even small tasks that are, mark the end of the school year and give them that closure, like cleaning out their locker, getting their yearbook signed. They don't get to do those things now. What about all the things they worked so hard for? Things they maybe worked all year for or worked several years for. These are things that unfortunately don't get to be rescheduled. So even if they earn their award, even if they get to still receive it, it's not the same. They don't get to go to the recognition dinner. They don't get to have their coach talking about them. They don't get to get dressed up and take photos together. That ability to celebrate is gone. Of course, there's all the rites of passage, all these special traditions that now our kids aren't getting to experience. And these are things that they watch their siblings get to do, they watched older friends get to do. Again, even though the schools are looking at a lot of virtual versions of these events, we know it won't be the same, right? We know that they're mourning the ability to walk across that stage and get that diploma. They've also lost all sense of control. They're not getting the opportunity to, control anything that's happening. And all of this happened so quickly. They didn't know on that last day that they weren't going to have the opportunity to go back. And the information keeps changing, which is incredibly unnerving and also causes us to feel like things aren't in our control. And in addition, on top of it, we're talking about something that involves our health, our safety. It's really a formula for feeling like everything is spinning out of control. They've also lost their sense of fun. Everything is so serious right now. Everywhere you look, there's adults with long faces, worried about the economy, worried about curves. And when this all started, kids were getting ready for spring break. They were starting to plan for the summer. And now all of that's gone. They don't get to plan to go to the amusement park or go to the movies. We've really made it difficult for them to be doing what they were supposed to be doing, which was enjoying themselves and planning for the future. Instead, right now, they're having to think about things like death and dying. So what happens if we don't process our grief? Unprocessed grief certainly has its pitfalls. If we put our energy into avoiding feelings, we're not living our lives properly. And in doing so, it can lead to depression and anxiety. We also can feel stuck in one of those stages that we talked about. And one of those stages is anger, which we know harms relationships. It harms our ability to do well at work and school. We might also turn to unhealthy habits like drugs and alcohol to cover up our painful feelings. And we might experience what some people describe as unresolved grief or interrupted grief, where really you're spending so much energy on avoiding future loss that you're not living at all. We don't want that for our teenagers. So let's talk about what we can do to help our teens. We'll start with 3 things that you're not going to do. And they're easy. It's really easy to do this. First off, don't avoid the topic because you think it's going to make it worse. And I know you're thinking, okay, my son or daughter seems to be coping fine. Why would I bring up such a terrible topic and wreck everything? Or you might be thinking, my son or daughter is really struggling. So why would I bring up such a terrible topic and pour salt in the wound? And the answer is because talking is healthy and necessary. It's something we need to do to process and to move forward. And really, this pandemic is a great opportunity to show your teenager that when things get rough, we talk to each other. So try to get past your own anxiety around feeling awkward about bringing up a difficult topic. Don't chicken out, even if, it starts off uncomfortable. We've all had difficult conversations with our teenagers before. And if you've talked to your teenager about sex, you can definitely talk to them about grief. Avoid using a Band-Aid, an emotional Band-Aid. So think back to when your toddler was running at the park, scraped her knee, you ran over there, you put a Band-Aid on, you kissed the boo-boo, and you were a superhero. But teens and their emotions are a lot more complex than a skinned knee. Teenagers want to process, they want to be heard. Imagine if you came home from work and you told your partner, I lost my job today. And your partner, because they care about you and they don't want to see you suffering and hurting, they say, well, what's the big deal? Don't freak out. There's lots of jobs out there. Why don't you start networking? Why don't you dust off your resume? Oh, I know. Why don't you call so-and-so and see if they're hiring at their company? So again, they're trying to cheer you up, but you will likely feel minimized. You'll feel like they're completely missing the point. It's not so much about you trying to get a new job. It's the fact that you liked the job you had and you didn't want to not continue to go to that job. So think about that as your teenager is talking to you about some of the things that they're missing right now. Try to avoid saying things like, well, it's okay, you can always play baseball next year, or at least you're only a sophomore, not a junior or senior. Try to avoid taking over the conversation, which I know is difficult to do because, again, we care about our kids. We don't want to see them hurting, so we want to fix it as quickly as we can. But keep in mind that no matter how much wisdom you have, you did not live through a pandemic as a teenager. So there's no way that you can actually completely 100% relate to them. So now is not the time to say, oh, well, I remember when I couldn't see my boyfriend, this is what I did. They're not going to be listening to that. They're probably going to end the interaction. So keep in mind that frequently people, not just teenagers, but people want to be heard. They just want to be listened to. They want to vent. They just want to get stuff off their chest. They want to process and just have you be there as a listening ear. And do your best to cultivate a repeat customer, right? Because really your goal is to have this teenager come back and talk to you again next time. You want them walking away from their interaction feeling like, hey, I got my needs met, not, oh my gosh, mom always makes this about her. Let's talk about ways that you can help them. And there's so many things you can do, and you don't need to be a therapist. First off, make sure that you are coping. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So just like the flight attendant told you to put on your oxygen mask first, that's what you're gonna do, because you wanna make sure that you don't pass out, you don't become incapacitated. You're no good to anyone like that. You wanna be well and available so that when your teenager comes to you, you're there to provide that support. Kind of on top of all of that is the fact that since we're sheltering in place, our teenagers can see everything we're doing. So trust me, your teenager notices that you had that third glass of wine. They also notice that you haven't showered in 2 days. These are not things you want them to notice. You want them to notice instead that you took some deep breaths after that really frustrating phone call for work. You went for a walk and got some air after you were feeling cooped up, or you reached for some fruit instead of chips. It's a great opportunity to model the kinds of coping skills we want them to demonstrate. So coming back to this concept, think about other loss your teen has experienced. Do an inventory of what they've experienced in their lifetime. Have they lived through your divorce? Have they experienced their own breakup? Have they lost somebody close to them? Think about how they coped before. Maybe there's something that worked before that could work again. Try to help them connect the dots to see why things feel so painful for them, that maybe it's triggering some other kind of loss for them. And remind them that in the past, they were sad and they worked through things, and this is what worked, and that over time they will feel better. Acknowledge their feelings, even the difficult ones. I know we tend to want to turn away from tough feelings and avoid them, but in this case, actually all the time, it's a good thing to help them name their feelings, help them identify what's going on. And you can just ask them direct questions. Hey, are you missing going to tennis practice? They might not realize what's going on. You can also share about your own feelings as a way to get the conversation started. I'm worried about grandma. What are you worried about? Help your teenager understand that it's okay to have mixed feelings, that frequently things are not so simple. They're not always so black and white, and that we can have both positive and negative feelings about the same thing. You love your spouse dearly, but there's that one thing they do that makes you furious, right? This pandemic has been obviously a terrible, horrible thing for all of us, but there have been some positives. We see people helping each other. We see communities coming together. Give your teenager your own examples. Lots of adults are saying, you know, I really wish the shelter in place weren't happening, but boy, it's amazing to not have to commute every day. We want to help them identify those mixed feelings because those feelings can be really confusing. Certainly validate their feelings. Make sure that they know that they are entitled to their feelings. There's no right or wrong way to experience feelings. There's nothing selfish about them missing going out with their friends. They're not a bad person because they're upset that prom got canceled. There's no such thing as something being too small or too petty to miss, because really that's just casting judgment on someone else's feelings, and feelings are natural. I know there's things that I miss walking into a Starbucks, but missing that doesn't mean that I don't also care about all the people who've been negatively affected by this pandemic. I can still be a caring person, but also be unhappy about my current situation. And that's the message you want to share with your teenager, and remind them that even though they're almost adults, they're still kids. It's not their job to take on all of the world's problems. It's okay for them to be thinking about how it affects them personally. Teach them about perspective. Be mindful of even how you describe what's going on. So for example, if we talk about being safe at home versus being stuck at home, those words describe the same situation, but they have a very different feeling to them. Help your teenager get outside kind of their own situation a little bit and recognize that there are other teenagers all over the country, all over the world who are struggling in the same way. And then certainly help them balance the negative with the positive. There's so much out there that's frightening and terrible, but at the same time, there's lots of inspirational stories. Help point those out to them. Maybe show them some reassuring data that what they're doing by staying home is working. Create some type of structure at home. This is so important. And I know that in the beginning, it may have felt good for your teenager to, stay up all night and then sleep in super late, but educate them about how when things are too loose like that and unscheduled, it starts to feel bad. We start to feel out of control because we don't know what to expect. So invite them to help you make a schedule. You probably have some version of a schedule going already because we've been doing this for a while, but maybe it's time to revisit it. Maybe the schedule gets adjusted weekly. It's not meant to be military style. It's really meant to be a guide. And it's a way to make sure they're doing the things that you need them to do, like getting up, showering, putting on street clothes, eating regularly, doing their schoolwork. It's also important, I think, for you to help them recognize that you want them to have time away from the family. So you can put that into the schedule as well, that private time. Just because we're all home together doesn't mean we all need to be doing things together all the time. And if there are coveted parts of the house, if everybody is fighting over the exercise equipment or the hammock or the garage, maybe the schedule has to include, some idea of who gets to do what when. But that'll help your teenager feel like you're respecting what's going on for them and recognizing what's important to them. Offer as many choices as you possibly can. They've had so much taken from them, so having options will feel so good to them, even if it's something small, like what we're having for dinner or what movie we're gonna watch. Do your best to avoid power struggles. Power struggles are never a good thing. Nobody ever wins them, but certainly with all this sheltering in place where we can't get away from each other and your teenager can't go to their friend's house to blow off steam, that really makes it an extra bad time to have power struggles in the house. You're going to encourage their hobbies because hobbies are coping skills. Hobbies help us feel good about ourselves. They're fun, they relieve stress, and they're great distractions. So show some interest in their interests. Ask them if they need supplies. Gift them some bullet journaling supplies. Maybe they need more sheet music. Maybe this is the time you finally buy them that guitar they've been asking for. My coworker got her son a weight set and it's made all the difference. He has something to do and he has stopped fighting with his brother. Encourage your teenager to stay in contact with others. If your teenager is more introverted, they might start to kind of let go of some relationships. So remind them that we're physically distancing, not socially distancing. And it's a great time for them and us to nurture relationships, maybe with people that we didn't have time to be in as much contact with before. Be creative in how you support your teenager. I hear from a lot of families about how, the different siblings in the family are all responding differently. Well, that makes sense. Everybody's an individual. So think about your kids and their preferences. One child might feel more supported by faith. Another child might just need more space. Think about what makes sense for them, ask them, and consider encouraging them to do something that involves their interests that helps other people, because giving back has a variety of benefits, including improving our mood. So keep the conversations happening. Unfortunately, this is not a one and done type of thing. We know that kids are going to go through the different stages of grief, so you want to be available as their needs change over time. Some families, they have regularly scheduled time that they're checking in with each other, and some families are more casual about it, and that's fine. Either way is totally fine. There's no right or wrong. What's important is that you're taking the time to check in. And, even if, again, it's a conversation or a topic that feels uncomfortable, bring it up. Try to broach the topic, try to connect with them, and take advantage of the fact that things have really slowed down in a lot of ways, so we have more time to check in. When your teenager does check in with you, be patient, be sensitive, recognize that even though their losses may seem small compared to all the things that you're worrying about, those are real issues for them. Give them focused attention, turn off the phone, don't multitask, And keep in mind that this time with our teenagers really is an unexpected gift. If they had their way, they wouldn't be home with us. They wouldn't be spending this amount of time with us. They'd be out with their friends. They'd still be at college. I feel like it's like that earned bonus time at the end of a video game. Our teens, you know, they were getting ready to launch and leave us, but now we have this extra time that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So as we wrap up, let's think about a few things. Let's remember that everything we talked about applies beyond COVID. Your family, unfortunately, is going to experience grief and loss in the future, but you'll know what to do because you'll have had practice. Second, we're all struggling together. There's no handbook for any of this. None of us have done this before. So be kind to yourself, seek support from one another, and remember that you and your teenager are doing the best that everybody can. Next, keep in mind that even if you completely blow an interaction with your teenager, it's okay. The best part about parenting is it doesn't end. So you're gonna have another opportunity. You'll have another chance. And even if you feel like your words fall flat or your teenager rolls their eyes at you, the fact that you tried will not be lost on your teen. And lastly, remember how resilient teenagers are. You're not going to damage them or hurt them by talking about grief and loss. In fact, having this dialogue with them could very well teach you something about how to cope and could give you some insight into who your teenager is. Okay, so that concludes my presentation for tonight. We'll go ahead and start answering questions.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. That was excellent, and I hope it was very helpful to our attendees. We have a couple of questions, and if you like, you can continue to add some more questions during this question and answer period. So the first question was, Jeremy's going to answer this one, or start off answering this question, is if we're pointing out to our teen that there's other teens all over the world who are also being affected by COVID right now, isn't that minimizing their feelings?
Steve, thank you so much for the question. I think it's a really excellent question. And I imagine that a lot of folks were probably wondering something similar. First, I should say that the way that a teenager might react to that comment is going to really depend on that teenager and their perspective, and of course what they're feeling. And you certainly know your child better than I do. So I'll just give you some ideas to consider as you decide whether or not to use this approach with your child or with your children. First, instead of making a statement that suggests that you know that children all over the world are feeling the same thing, which also suggests that you know exactly what your child is feeling, you might say something like, I imagine a lot of kids all over the world are probably feeling something similar. And you can even tell your child that of course, nobody knows what they're feeling better than they do, but that you would like to know more about how they're feeling, and maybe even invite them to just tell you. And when you make that comment that you imagine that lots of other children probably feel something similar, their reaction to that question, of course, will guide what direction you take from there. If it seems that they feel really comforted by that, by the idea that they're not alone, that what they're feeling isn't unique to them, that they're not going crazy, that they're not having to suffer this feeling completely in isolation, that it helps them feel connected to a global community, then you hit the mark. If instead they have some reaction that suggests that they feel minimized, or they feel that you're minimizing their experience, then of course you can simply apologize for that and let them know that you're really just trying some way to comfort them, and that you're really just curious to learn more about how they're feeling, and clearly you don't know, but you're open to learning about it. And I think if you do that in a very sincere and authentic way, it really allows an opportunity for your child to connect with you, And even if they don't think that you understand them yet, they might really appreciate that you're willing to have this conversation with them, to create a safe space for them to express themselves. And of course, that you're making a sincere effort to try to comfort them. And oftentimes that's what comes through more than the words themselves. So, so if you're not sure whether or not to try this technique, maybe try it in a gentle way and then just watch for your child's reaction to kind of guide where you go next.
Thank you, Jeremy. We had another question, and it was about when I go to the grocery store, my teenage daughter, becomes fearful for me. And it was also coupled with maybe concerns about parents' job insecurity and how to handle that. So I think one of the suggestions that Sandy had was to not avoid topics, that if you're concerned about your job or your spouse is concerned about their job, your teen is going to be thinking probably the same, having that same question, because there's a lot of people who are losing their jobs or unemployed right now. So having an honest conversation with your child about the potential as you see it, and also knowing, helping them know what the plan is if that were to happen, and to give some assurance that as a family, we will work together to get through this. I think that teens, like adults, can fall into sort of two categories. On one side, you have people who are very scared about COVID for a variety of very good reasons. And then on the other side, you have some teens who are sort of blowing it off, and they think that everybody's making a big deal out of nothing. And so you kind of have teens who are avoiding adhering to social distancing, maybe trying to leave the house at night. On the other hand, you have teens who are afraid to leave the house, even when there's a good reason to do so. And I think both of those are ways that people cope with new, unfamiliar situations that have some potentially dangerous consequences. And so again, trying to talk to your teen about where they're at with their feelings, and giving them information about COVID that's actual information. There is, the percentages show that about almost 80% of people in our community have no symptoms or have very, very mild symptoms. There's, maybe 20% who have more moderate symptoms, and a very small percentage that have more significant symptoms that require hospitalization. The actual number of deaths that are occurring with COVID is much smaller than they originally anticipated. And it is primarily people who have a lot of comorbidities or who are older. And so those can be helpful facts. The reality is you can never predict who's going to be affected, but that's why our public health department is encouraging us to do the right things by social distancing and masking. And then I think, trying to address the underlying anxiety that is sometimes driving these behaviors, and helping your teen learn some healthy ways to cope with that. And in Jeremy's talk last week, he talked about some healthy coping mechanisms that people can use to try to help them feel less anxious. And if you weren't able to be a part of the presentation last week, it is posted on the John Muir website. Okay, I have a question for Sandy next, and it has to do with a teen who is retreating to her bedroom during the day, sleeping in, very withdrawn, completely depressed, much less interested in activities that she used to enjoy. Aside from time with a therapist, do you have any suggestions for drawing her out a bit into the real world? So do you have some ideas that you can suggest, Sandy?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I'm guessing a lot of families are seeing this at home. I guess I'd start with wanting to know what's going on with the sleep. We talked last week, and I'll review again for anyone who wasn't present before, that we want to make sure our teenagers are practicing good sleep hygiene. It's very, very tempting for them right now to stay up all night on their phones, or binge watching things on TV, and then sleep all day because they don't have to get up and get to school, and they can kind of manage their schoolwork on their own time. So I'd want to make sure that a teenager that's in their room and sleeping in all the time, is having a good sleep routine so that they're going to bed at a decent hour and then getting up at a decent hour so that that structure is there. I'd also want to know what's your teenager doing in there? Are they using coping skills? Maybe they're journaling, maybe they're drawing, maybe they're writing cards to first responders. Depending on what's going on in their bedroom, it could be okay. If they're sleeping the entire time or they're, crying, they're getting in a really negative headspace, then yeah, we don't want that. We want to draw them out, pull them out. It could be that the things that they would generally do to keep busy are not things that they can do, right? They can't go to gymnastics. They can't, go to their friend's house. Are there things that maybe they'd be interested in trying now that, again, we're limited in what we can do at home, but maybe finding out if there's something that we can, support them in learning about, trying out. And, letting your teenager know you miss them. You miss seeing them. You wish they would pop out once in a while. They might not realize that. They might think, oh, mom and dad are just all, they're so focused on working from home and they seem really stressed out. They might think they're doing you a favor by staying away. So letting them know that you'd like to see more of them can be a positive.
Okay, and first of all, I just want to say there is such great engagement. We're getting so many questions, and again, like Sandy said, we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible. And the ones that we don't get to tonight, we're going to take note of and try to find another way to get answers out to all of you. So let's see. Karen says that her daughter is refusing to leave the house, even to go for a walk, and she's worried about her lack of exercise, fresh air, and sunshine, and asks if there's any thoughts on how to encourage her. Well, the solution is probably going to be different for every kid. Sandy said something during her presentation about considering what has worked in the past. And I think sometimes when there's a real crisis, when circumstances seem so unusual and so different from what we're used to, we start thinking that we need to almost reinvent the wheel, or we need to build solutions from scratch. And so I really like what Sandy said about consider what kinds of things have worked in the past. And you can even get into a conversation with your children about times in the past when they were feeling this way or dealing with similar things, and what they remember about how they got through it. So I think that's a good place to start. Also, it's really good to get exercise and get some sunshine, but it's not the end of the world if right now your daughter just doesn't feel like doing it. And so we also want to keep a good perspective about that and not panic that just because she's not getting sunshine, fresh air, and exercise, that something awful is going to happen. And I think it's okay for you to sincerely express your concern. If you're going to go out for a walk, invite her. If there's something you can do in the yard, if the issue is that she doesn't feel safe leaving the house right now, but there's something that you can do in the front or backyard that allows her to still feel close enough to home to feel safe, but still get out and get a little sunshine, I think that can be helpful as well. Sometimes you have to get kind of creative, and it's also okay to find something that is incrementally better than the current situation without trying to fix the problem perfectly or entirely. So, and by the way, I should say that as the audience is reading these questions and hearing our answers, if any of you have ideas or suggestions or even something from your own experience that you think would help answer the question, we would love to hear those, and we'll make sure to share them with everybody. Sometimes learning from other families who are going through something similar could be the best kind of guidance and advice.
Okay, we have another question, and there's actually two questions. One question is about whether it's okay to talk to teens about the possibility of death in these uncertain times to prepare them. And then another question was how to help your teen who may be grieving from a loss of a close grandparent. So I think that it is, again, can be useful for your teen to get some accurate information about the possibility of death. Again, the percentages of people dying from COVID are actually much less than what they originally thought, but there is the possibility. So that is a reality. So that information, giving accurate information, and then of what your family might be doing to protect each other or to protect other family members, and sort of giving them some assurance that you all are doing everything you can to follow the public health guidelines to minimize that risk is beneficial. I think grief is hard, and everybody experiences grief and sort of deals with grief in a different way. I think sort of what Sandy started off sharing tonight, which is there's no magic words that we can say that can fix it or make it feel better. I think sometimes what people want is just to be acknowledged and to have them feel understood, that we understood the depth of their pain, or we understand the depth of what they're going through, and to just let them know that we're there. We're there to give them a hug if that's what they find helpful. We're there to listen if they feel like talking. We're there to try to work with them to help them cope better. So for some people, sometimes distraction can be a great coping mechanism, getting your mind off of feelings that are painful after you've sat with them too long. Sometimes journaling, writing, sometimes re-experiencing memories. So everybody has a different way to cope, and there's no magic answer. I think what we know to be true is that although grief can be very, very painful, over time, it gets less painful. That is the reality. Nobody experiences the same level of grief forever. Over time, it tends to dissipate, and things do tend to get easier. And that length of time will vary with each person. So asking your teen what helps them feel better when they're in a sad place, and then, or helping them try new things can sometimes be beneficial. But reality is sometimes just time will heal. There's also books, there's online resources. One of the things that we can refer you to is the UCSF website for the Department of Psychiatry. They have a lot of resources on grieving, and they have some phone apps, they have some books to recommend, they have some webinars that you can attend, and your team might find some of those helpful to help them get through their grief. There's also some books that they recommend, and even some movies.
You know, I'd like to share some of these comments that are coming in. No sooner did I encourage you to share your own ideas and solutions than we got a few. Danielle says that she loves drawing with her kids to experience nature. And if they don't want to go out, she offers them a supplement of vitamin D to help the chemical imbalance that they might be experiencing by not getting as much sunlight. Thank you, Danielle. Eileen also said that that she and her family have meetings to discuss how they each need privacy now that they're all sheltering in place, and that there is a great beverage table at Costco they found for only $39 that they were able to use as a temporary desk, so that their kids have their own space and they don't all have to share the same table or desk. They've also been having family Zoom game nights. Eileen, I've been doing that with my family as well. It's a great way to get together, and you can play all kinds of games. You can play Pictionary. We played a version of Taboo, which is a lot of fun. She says that they also, her family plays categories when they do the virtual game night. And there's also a link from Home and Garden about games during sheltering at home too. So thank you both. Those are really excellent suggestions. You know, I also wanted to say as a follow-up to the comments I made earlier, one of the things that makes parenting difficult is knowing when to use reward and when to use punishment. And it turns out that humans are much more motivated by reward than we are by punishment. And so sometimes the negotiation is first about finding out what your child wants the most. And if it's something that's reasonable and it's safe and it can be given to them, or they can be allowed to do that thing in exchange for something else that you would like for them, that might be a good way to negotiate. And the conversation starts with saying, you know, what would you really like to do right now? What do you think would make you feel better? And to make sure that there's enough of a list that you can find at least one, if not several, that are things they can actually do or have, given all the kind of restrictions that we're experiencing right now. And then talk about how you would like them to do that, as well as some of the things that you would like them to do that maybe they're not as thrilled about, so that it's kind of balanced. And then Eileen asked me about how to play Taboo virtually. There's actually several game apps for free that I found on the phone, and at every site where my family is tuning in through Zoom or some other kind of virtual meeting site, we all take turns. If there's at least 2 people at each household, one person looks over the shoulder to make sure you don't say any of the taboo words. And then everybody else who's tuning in from their homes is trying to guess the word. Anyway, for those of you who've never played Taboo, you might not know what I'm talking about, but it's worth looking up some game apps on your phone. And when you guys connect through a virtual meeting site, as long as everybody has the same app loaded, you can usually find creative ways to all play the same game together. And it's a great way to connect without having to be physically in the same space.
Okay, we have another question for Sandy. Sandy, you mentioned not to make this about us as parents, but to listen. And you also mentioned that it can be helpful to remind them of things that can give them perspective. This father is asking, I'm a child of revolution and war, and I had similar experiences that happened to me that caused me to grieve when I was a kid, a teenager. Is talking about these experiences wrong, or do you think it would help my child get perspective and help them understand that I can relate to what they're going through?
I think it's a great question. And of course, as parents, we would want to share our own experiences to teach our kids and relate to our kids. And I certainly didn't mean that you should never do that. What I meant was that there's a time for listening and a time for giving advice. And you as a parent will have to gauge what that moment means to your child and during that interaction. And if you're not sure, you can always ask them. You can ask them, hey, is it okay if I give you a little feedback, or if I tell you a story about when I was growing up? I think kids would be receptive to that depending on how you introduce it and what your timing is. Also being mindful about what you're sharing, because you know, we certainly don't want to overwhelm them with a lot of information, and then on top of everything they're worrying about now, have them worry about, oh my gosh, my dad had to live through that. That's horrible. I never knew that he went through that. So if it's something they are already, you know, semi-aware of, it's something that your family has talked about before, you know, certainly I would, you know, bring it into the discussion as a way to support them with their permission. You know, if it's a big story and maybe you're needing to kind of process some of your own material, you know, kind of think about who you do that with, maybe even try it out on somebody before you share it with your teenager. And then of course, I think it all depends on your particular teen and how old they are and, you know, their relationship with you. But I think that sharing our grief experiences can teach so much, because they can also see that you survived and you got through something painful.
Okay, we don't have any other questions that we think we are seeing out there. Are there any others that people would like to type in the last few minutes that we have left? We have time for maybe one more.
So the two questions that just came in are from Anne. My daughter was isolated before. How can I help her now? And then we also have one about suggestions for how to handle grief from loss of sports. Sandy, do you want to field either of those?
Well, I think grief from loss of sports, there's losing that physical activity, there's losing the team component depending on what the sport was, there's that engagement, there's maybe that connection with the coach, there's just the structure of going to practice and having a game and feeling great about yourself afterwards, and then going and getting pizza with your team afterwards. There's so many layers to it. I think, you know, trying to kind of break that down with your teen and talking to them about what it is they miss, and if there's any of that possibly that can be recreated somehow. People are getting so creative, like we just heard about all these board games that we can now play virtually. You know, if they're missing their coach, maybe they can connect over the phone. If, you know, they're missing a big team celebration, maybe that can be something that's done virtually, or maybe, you know, plans can be made to figure out how to make up a game or something like that. But I know that sports are a huge part of what our teens do. And, you know, if they're just missing that physical outlet, maybe there's, you know, a way to recreate that for them as well. But breaking it down, talking to them about what's going on to understand exactly what they're going through, I think could help.
Well, we probably have time to try to give a brief answer to one more, and then there are several that we weren't able to get to tonight. So we'll find a way to maybe get some question and answer document out to everybody who attended. And some of these we might also try to address in next week's forum. So there was one question about, what about if the kid seems fine? Should we still bring up the conversation about how they're feeling? First of all, kids can seem fine and not really be fine. You know, this could be because they're, you know, putting on a game face, or they don't want you to ask them because they are, maybe they're worried that you're going to try to fix them, or that you'll judge them, or have some kind of reaction that they won't feel comfortable with. So that's one thing to consider. But I think it's really just a nice gesture to ask people how they're doing, and to do it with really authentic interest. It's a way to make an empathic gesture, and empathy, showing that that you care enough to want to see things from another person's perspective. You want to take the opportunity to join them in whatever feelings they're having, even if those feelings are good and pleasant feelings. Is really about creating a space or an opportunity to connect. And connection is so important for human beings of all ages, from the infant to young children to teenagers to adults. And so yes, I think even when your kid seems fine, first of all, they might not be, and how would you know if you don't ask? And even if they are fine, I think making that kind of compassionate, empathic gesture to let them know that that you're curious about them, and that you want to know what they're feeling, even the good stuff, especially the good stuff, but also the bad stuff, the difficult stuff. And even if they tell you that they're just fine, and you're prepared to accept that, the gesture you've made, as long as it's sincere, I think is still meaningful. And sooner or later, when they're feeling like they need to talk to someone, knowing that you've expressed that curiosity and you've made the invitation might make it more likely that they will come to you and talk to you about what's going on.
So in closing, we want to thank you for attending tonight. We appreciate all the great questions and really appreciate that although you may think your question is just specific to you, there are a lot of parents out there who probably have similar situations that they're dealing with. And so we want to thank you for bringing those forward so that we could address those. Thank you for your attendance tonight. Next week, the sign up is available for you to sign up, and we will have the slides from the presentation tonight up on the website in the next few days. Thank you, Sandy, for the great information tonight. It was really helpful, and we appreciate how clearly you presented that to everybody. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Stay safe and stay well.